Hello friends, family, former lovers, former enemies. This is John Edward Willie, and what I hope to do in this video is to explain to you how I meditate in 3 easy steps. I've never been one to believe in shortcuts or like easy paths or this idea that there are like 3 principles that can change your life, but I really do think there's a kind of threefold path to unlocking a kind of openness, a kind of sense of comfort, and a sense of exhilaration at almost any moment and in almost any place. And what I mean to say is that as someone who's worked as a server in a high volume restaurant, or has worked in bars or nightclubs, and has been in very, very difficult situations as a person, I have discovered that sometimes there are theories and ideas that through practice come to have a really powerful effect. And another part of this is interesting because what it has meant to me is also what they call reappropriating, or that is reusing ideas that other people have developed, but using them for your own purposes and your own means. And so in both religious traditions and in like Buddhist traditions, there's a belief in prayer and a belief in meditation. And it's precisely those ideas as practices that I am quote unquote reappropriating. That is, I think of meditation and prayer as having something to do with a way of existing that really has nothing to do with how it is often taught, not only on YouTube or in common practices, but in traditions as a whole. And in studying religion or theology and even Buddhism for a number of years, and having sort of had a taste for the orthogonal paths within those traditions, that is, for the more radical, often overlooked traditions in Christianity, for instance, and within Buddhism, I've discovered something akin to what I really think to be a kind of path, not only into the self, but as I say, out of the self. And so I believe that it can be rather simple or trite when you hear these things, but I think that the simplicity is sort of deceptive because there is an extraordinary power in these ideas, and yet it's also very difficult to practice, and it becomes easier over time. But I think what's most interesting is that it can be challenged. So these are not precepts or prescriptive ideas that can help everybody everywhere. These are things that I've discovered almost haphazardly or accidentally in my own experience. And so I posit them as experimental thoughts. Now, of course, you can tell that I tend to be overly intellectual. I tend to overthink things. And to be honest, I'm a kind of a closeted romantic, I suppose. I mean, I'm especially a kind of closeted revolutionary. And this isn't obvious in the way that I live or the way that I speak, but I think that's really a tribute to what I consider to be meditative practices. And so I'm going to lay those out briefly, and then I'm going to go into depth a little bit more about what they really mean and how you can apply them in your life. And I wrote an article earlier today about this because that's sort of how I'm approaching these videos now. I tend to write short articles about the subject and then use the article as like a basis for exploring through speech and through dialogue with listeners the ideas and the seeds that begin in these articles. So what are these notions besides the preliminary preface that I just give regarding what I mean by meditation and what I mean by prayer? Well, the first thing is that I think it's important to see that it's not unrealistic to say that every thought you've ever had is a lie, or to say that thinking is not true. Now, it's also true to say that thinking is not false. And so you can get into these sort of like games about the nature of language and the nature of thinking, but I think that's to miss the point, because what I'm trying to suggest is something a little bit simpler than that. Because what we call thinking is an expression of self-consciousness, and self-consciousness comes from consciousness. And self-consciousness is something that in many ways human beings have more than many other species, or it's something that we sort of have a significant way of doing that is different than other species. Because yeah, whales and chimpanzees sort of express a kind of self-consciousness, but it's nothing like what we do. And not only that, but for intellectuals or for a lot of people, it's sort of seen as being the crowning jewel of civilization and human life. In fact, all of culture that is sort of expressive of this kind of self-awareness is seen as being a tribute to the human being. But I think I disagree with that. And I don't disagree with it because I'm a peon or I'm an anti-intellectual or I'm a country bumpkin, although I do contain elements of all of those. It's because what I prize actually is something that we have in common with all animals and all creatures, and that is what is called simple consciousness. And yet I'm a philosopher, you know, I'm a closeted intellectual. But the only way that I'm able to do that is that it's not like I have an on and off switch, but I have a relationship to thinking that allows me to practice it for all it's worth, but also to not be controlled by it, to not be determined by it. I'm sort of moving because the rain is starting to fall. But I'm hoping to explore this more fully later on. But what I mean to suggest is that we fail to use thinking really for what it's for. We fail to become the kind of critical thinkers that we could become, which would not mean being a critical theorist, but would mean thinking critically about the options you have, the choices that you can make in your life, and then exercising the courage and willpower to fill out that becoming that you already are, and to navigate the complexity of your life in the best way possible, not to achieve like an ultimate outcome, but to live a less stupid life than you would otherwise. In other words, that's really what thinking is, and it's what the philosopher Aristotle thought of as being instrumental thinking. Now, we have problems, and we fail to solve those problems, and so we live in a constant state of problem solving. And not only that, but that we are around other people who compulsively think, and we fail to free ourselves from that. And so what I hope to elucidate in these videos and others is that there is a way to free yourself from it, and yet it is apparently paradoxical. But I'll go into that in a bit. So the second part that I'm meaning to get at is that when we're learning to doubt thoughts and we're learning to be skeptical of all of our thoughts, what we're doing is creating detachment. We're creating a separation from ourselves. And again, this is something that we learn to practice in everyday life. It's not something that we're writing about or thinking about. It's something that allows us to relax, because in letting go of these thoughts and it's sort of seeing that your thoughts are largely not helping you, you learn how to relax the feelings that are really keeping gripped up tight those thoughts. And so I think that there's a sort of loop between our thoughts and our feelings that make it feel very natural. And since we're around other people doing the same thing, it feels very natural. But that loop is, I think, what's very fascinating, because it's like this thread between feeling and thoughts that makes it feel compulsively real. And that's what I hope to impart, is that once you get free of that, it's actually not so real. And it's actually not a healthy way of being in the world. And so I'm also hesitating a lot because I'm aware of how stupid this really sounds. And yet it's so real to me. But it's not real in the way that I wouldn't challenge it, like if someone didn't give me a reason to challenge it. Like, it's not that these thoughts aren't experiments, but that they've held me so much. And yet, like, I don't know how to communicate this stuff to anyone. And I've been so arrogant. My ego has been so big that I've really just fucked up, because I've made people's lives worse. So what we're not doing is taking this and using it as something that we apply to other people. And I think in the third point that I want to get at, that's something that we will free ourselves from. But I think when you're thinking about yourself, right, if you begin to see that when you think really well, that is when you get your life together, when you use thinking as a way of maximizing your own autonomy and really just using what you have for the best ends possible, I think that like qualified what appears to be an undramatic way of thinking about what thinking is. I think that's quite expansive, quite freeing. But what it also means recognizing is that when you're really bad at doing it, you can't stop doing it. And so what we're trying to get free of is that compulsive need to always think. And the way that we get free from that is by seeing that in spite of the fact that thinking does help you, it's not real. Like, thinking is something that moves through us, and it's like software. it's like a spirit, like a mind that moves through us, but it's not here for us. It's not here for our advantage per se. Like, it's not here to help us. It's something that we use as a tool and a technique for these other reasons that I'm getting at, namely like learning how to see. So I think thinking is a way of like getting our lives put together so that we can not think and we can not feel. And I think feeling and thinking are central to my own life. So it's very paradoxical. But basically, we want to learn how to use meditation and prayer as a way of not feeling and not thinking so much that it's working against us. Like, I really believe that we can feel very deeply when we understand like what feeling really is, and we can really think really powerfully. Like, it's astonishing what we can do with our minds, but it's also astonishing how our minds get in our own way. And that's why we have phrases like college educated idiot, and that's why people who have degrees tend to be the stupidest, craziest. Like, you ever notice that? Like, people that are really educated tend to be out of their minds bonkers, you know? And so people that are very smart and very sensitive tend to be on a lot of drugs, and they tend to drink a lot too. And I think that has a lot to do with this. And I've nearly been destroyed by thinking and feeling myself, yet I'm also, on the other hand, not advocating anti-intellectualism. This doesn't have anything to do with that. And I'm not advocating Buddhism or any kind of religious thinking. I'm hoping to reimagine those kind of things, but to take it back for people that I think are sort of like what I am, like, which is something like a secular naturalist. And again, I'm not like a reductivist, I'm not scientific, but I'm hoping to recover life itself. Like, it's the affirmation of life, amor fati, that I'm fundamentally interested in. And my fundamental faith is in life itself. And of course, when I say life, I do mean literature. And when I say literature, I do mean poetry. Now, I'll explain that much more fully, much later. I'm hoping, and I'm trying for all I'm worth, to make this video short, to make it accessible. And I'm simply trying to explain what I'm going to explain. And yet I'm already like getting caught up in being unable to be proleptic, which is a fancy way of saying I'm trying to qualify what I'm saying in a way that's like not terribly sincere, not terribly earnest. So I've got to let go of that. But the second thing that I'm hoping to explain is that when we are learning how to doubt, we don't want to like live in a state of doubt. And this is something that's really important to me that I'm going to go into much later. So I'm sort of planting a seed with this idea. But when we learn how to be skeptical, when you learn how to be super skeptical and doubt everything, you don't want to be cynical. Like, and cynicism means that you don't believe in anything. And not only that, but you don't even believe in yourself. It's not that that's not a healthy position, and it's not that I'm not a kind of nihilist myself. Like, I'm a closeted communist nihilist. Yeah, a closeted communist nihilist. So there's a lot more to say about that. But we're not a passive nihilist, as Nietzsche said. We're active nihilists. And so we're to use that word reappropriate, we're reappropriating Nietzsche's idea of nihilism, because that idea of nihilism is deeply misunderstood, and it's associated with cynicism. But I have to go into that later, because again, I'm trying to be like simple with what I'm saying, and I'm trying to show you something that is so powerful. It is so meaningful to me. But you know, at a certain point in your life, you realize that you can't communicate anything, and it's not like you can't communicate anything, but you have to let go of that tendency when you're with people. You have to affirm people 100%, and that means letting go of this. And perhaps that's the real beauty of making these videos, is that I can at least attempt to do that. You know, these are like messages in bottles that I'm throwing out there, because no one in real life, including myself, wants to hear somebody else tell them how they can free themselves. Like, I think that's step number one for how to disconnect yourself from other people. So I'm working against that. In fact, honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing, except that when I renamed my channel using my own name, I discovered like a kind of radical humility and a kind of vulnerability that's really powerful, and I hope it's coming through in these videos. But what I mean by the second point about taking the first point regarding the power of skepticism to not only think clearly about your life, but to free yourself from the belief that thoughts can free you, but to doubt even that is to practice a more profound kind of skepticism. And that gives you a kind of detachment from feelings. Now, I've said two things here. And in a lot of my life, I come off as an idiot. I come off as stupid. And that's because most of my life, I've kind of striven to be as intelligent as possible. And I've striven to be sort of the smartest guy in the room. And I've also been so much otherwise that this in many ways is a triumph, because I think the very joy and richness of life comes when you allow yourself to be what would otherwise ostensibly be called stupid or thoughtless or almost like cold. Because what you're actually doing is practicing the third point that I want to get at. And this is what I consider to be the very point of meditation. It's to actually get outside of yourself. So the point of meditation and prayer isn't to think a thought, but to have an intention at all. It isn't to have a feeling about anything at all. In fact, it's to practice a kind of absence that allows the world's presence to move in. And I know that sounds crazy, but it has everything to do with letting go of your identity and letting go of your mind and rediscovering your brain and rediscovering your body. But it's paradoxically impossible to do, and it's impossible to communicate. Now, that's a part of like the benefit that I get from studying like Vedantic traditions, like in Buddhism, or what's called like Hermetic traditions and Gnosticism and Christianity, because it's at this point that these traditions actually offer quite a bit of insight. Because if you look at like the works of the church fathers, the so-called church fathers with Augustine and others, and if you look at the thoughts of like Lao Tzu and Taoist traditions, you find that they're wrestling with what is sometimes taken to be the problem of grace. That is the problem of sort of freeing yourself from who you are. I should probably start walking home since it's raining, right? I probably don't want to be sitting under a tree. But hopefully I don't get struck by lightning like on the way home. But this third point is that you want to become like a person who isn't thinking and isn't feeling. And it's not because thinking and feeling are bad. It's not because they don't have an appropriate place in your life, but because the whole richness and meaning of life is discovered outside of yourself. It's discovered in the singularity of the world itself. But this isn't an idea. It's not a part of the imagination. It's a part of reconnecting to the creaturely side of yourself that in many ways, because of the advances of our civilization and the way we live, we've also deeply disconnected from. Like, no matter what civilization you're living in, you're, by being a symbolic creature, by being domesticated, by living agricultural lives, by living out this experiment like we do, you're living within a particular way of thinking that we take for granted as being natural, but it's largely the source of all of our alienation and deep frustration. And I don't mean that to offer a solution. It's not a solution. It's not an absolute either. It's merely a suggestion that one should play with the idea that, you know, as Johnny Rotten, the singer for the Sex Pistols, had said, you've been cheated. Now, it's not that, like, I'm not saying that you should give up your life and run into the wild, but you should at least see the truth, which is that civilization, its fundamental premise, should be questioned, because it's constantly promising a future that for many people never comes. And so the question is, like, should you give yourself away to that promise? Or should you perhaps attempt to recover and take back like what you could have, which is right in front of you, which isn't the whole world, and it's not like, as I keep saying, a magical solution, but it's what we have. It's our creaturely self. And I think that this thing exists beneath the surfaces of self-awareness that we egoistically like assume to be the very point of life, but it's not. But we're not also, I'm not advocating a kind of dumb approach. This isn't like the typical kind of Midwestern like smugness that you find in a lot of people that wants to suggest that, oh yeah, things are what they are, and so there's no point to thinking. And not only that, but, you know, only weak people have feelings. This has like really nothing to do with that, because that in itself is not even in the arena. Like, people like that who would hear these ideas and these notions, who are already religious in the negative sense, or Buddhist in the negative sense, believe it or not. They really don't know it, but they fail to grasp the most fundamental of things, right? And that's why to this day, like as a server, for instance, in restaurants, you will have people ask you if there's anything they can pray for you. You know, I don't know if this happens across the country, but in the Midwest, you will have tables who will pray and ask you if they can pray for you. You know, it's one of the most insulting things that you can say, right? And the thing that I tend to say is that I have nothing to ask for, and that it would be arrogant for me to even presume that I would know what is best for me. And they sort of like get this glow in their eyes because this is precisely what they want to hear. And so it's kind of like a snake, like biting somebody and like creating a kind of like softness that allows me to practice my fundamental move, which is the